In this video lesson, we'll take a look at using files for data storage, but also to retrieve data from files to be used within our program. So we can use files instead of the keyboard, the monitor screen, to allow for input of information, but also to output information. This would allow us to use information between programs, whether it's saving information in between programs or accessing information between programs. Oftentimes, the programs that we use, when it comes time for data storage, they actually create a file with that data stored in it so that it can be retrieved when we go to execute the program again, literally turning the program on again. So we'll look at the steps for opening the file, using the file, whether we're going to read from it or write to it, or even both, and then the idea of closing the file. So in order for us to use the streaming in and out to a text file, we do need the header file fstream. So this is going to be one of our directives that we need to add to the preprocessor section in order for us to be able to use the streaming option. If you remember, we had the IO stream, that was the input-output stream. The F stream is for the file streaming. All right, we will need to create objects from the file streaming class. We had the cout object and the cin object from the IO stream that we will use, but we're going to have an in file stream and an out file stream in order to allow for that interface to occur. So we will need to create an in stream. Well, we didn't have to do this with the cout object or the cin object, but when we do file streaming, we need to create those objects. And so that's what's happening here. This guy right here, an in file is an arbitrary identifier for bringing in information. I can name it whatever I want. In file just is very intuitive that while I'm trying to bring information in, the in file object will do that for us, whereas the out file is going to allow for output of information. But I need to do this in my program. These two executions have to occur in my program. We didn't have to do this when we were using the IO stream, but we'll have to do this for file streaming. What that will do is it will create a link between the file, the outside part of the program, and the inside of the program. All right. We will then need to call to open it. So open is a reserved word. And so what's happening here is the in file object is calling to open a file. Okay, and so the inventory.dat is a type of file. It's not a text file, but it is going to open that file. But I also need to call to close the file, and that's for security reasons. You know, the idea that we should allow the program to close the file, we should not allow the termination of the program to just close the file for us. The file name may include a drive or a path, and we'll need to do that so that we can save it either out to our P drive or out to our C drive. We will need to include a path to where do we want that file to go. And so the output file will be created, and so we'll see that pop up then in a folder that we assign it to. We'll see that program be created. The input file must exist in order for the open to work. So I can always test for that also if there's a failure. So if it doesn't exist, I can't open it. But I will be able to create files that don't exist. I can call to have one created in, my folder that didn't previously exist. So we can test a file stream object to make sure that there aren't any operation failures. So in this case, in file is calling to open up test.txt. And as long as that is not an in file, so the idea is if the file didn't exist, then there could be a thrown error so that the user knows that there was a problem. And that problem might be that the file did not previously exist. Okay. So when using the files, we can output to the file like we would to the output. So I could, tell it to output this string inventory report in the same way that I would tell it to see out to the display screen inventory report. I can tell it to put that string out into this text file. Take notice to the insertion operators are the same for the idea of going out. They're both less than signs, but then the idea that I can also bring it in. So this guy is bringing in what most likely is an integer value from, or it could be a double value from the text file itself. So these are both bringing in information from the text file. And it is most likely formatted in a way that the data is put in there and stored specifically in an order of quantity in stock and quantity on order in the way it is bringing that information in. We can use loops in the same way that we used loops for displaying to the screen. We can use while loops to also put information out into a text file. And that idea of the stream extractor, remember that idea of inputting information. So while the input file has something to bring into the program, we it will continue to iterate. If it reaches the end of the file, then it will fail that loop and move on to the next execution. Within that while loop, I can tell it to output to the display screen. I can pull that information in and get a running total from the data file, and so on. So in the same way that I use the keyboard to input information and I use the display screen to output information, we can use the in file and out file objects in this example to do that exact same thing. I'm inputting information from an outside source using, that in file and that idea of that cin, but then the out file is going to be used in the same way as the cout, where I'm going to take that information and I'm going to put it out somewhere, whether it's the display screen or a text file. We need to close the file also, so we should be closing the file whether we're using it for input or output. It is a method. It's got parentheses tagged on to the end of it like the open did. It has parentheses. I do not need to necessarily indicate what the file it is that is closing. It will close the file that is open. We will not look at multi-files. That's a little bit more complicated outside the scope of this class, working in multi-files. Okay, you shouldn't wait for the operating system to close it. You don't want to cause unnecessary errors and things like that while executing the program. We can have the user specify the file name, so we can actually ask them for what do you want to call the file. So we can take that information in and actually let them create that using a string to create that, so they can open that value. So in the example here, in this example, we can see the inclusion of the file stream. We create an input object. They're not doing any output in this one. So a string, they just use the identifier file name. And so this one is going to allow the user to input a file name. And so the input object then will call to open that file name. And when we take a look here at the example, they use list of numbers.txt, and files names should be very similar to project names and variable names, where we don't use, spaces, things like that in the identification of. And so here, while the input file has numbers in it, it is going to see out what's in there, then it closes the input statement. But otherwise, if there isn't information to drag in, it will give us an error in opening the file. So that gives us some basic information as to how input and output of file streaming will work, and we'll see it play out in the lab.